In this podcast, I'll be talking to Norman Fenton, the British mathematician and risk professor who challenged the official COVID narrative that was being pumped out at the time by the mainstream media. But in this podcast, we're not going to talk about COVID. We're going to talk about the overwhelming propaganda against Israel by the mainstream media and how once again people are forgetting to do some critical thinking and ask questions about what the mainstream media is telling them. Watch the podcast with me. Hello, Norman. How are you?
Hi, Popkin. Yeah, I'm good. It was great to actually meet you in person. I mean, it feels like we're sort of old friends somehow. We sort of made a bit
Even
of a
though we only met
connection.
once, and that was yesterday at the 2CTV conference. But it's a pleasure to have Norman Fenton on my podcast today. Norman, you were you still are. You're a mathematician and you're a professor of risk and the Emeritus at the Queen Mary University. And you
Yeah,
became famous to the public because you started to challenge the COVID narrative with your own skills in statistics and mathematics, and you started
yeah.
challenging it. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So when you were involved in that, you went to a conference. The conference was a Freedom Movement conference, and it was to challenge the tyranny of the World Health Organization and the one narrative that they were pushing about COVID. Am I right so far?
Yeah.
This Freedom Movement conference was in June 2023.
Yeah, it's a very well attended conference. I think they even had to turn people away.
But what you noticed there was amongst these people who were there mainly to challenge this one official narrative that was being pushed about COVID. There were conspiracy theorists, and a lot of them were very anti-Semitic. In fact, you were given a book. You were all given a book. I actually thought it was a booklet, but you just showed it to me before the interview, and they said, "Do you want to show it again?" Yeah. So
That's the
it's a
book,
1,000-page book
pages,
called 180 Degrees, and it was written by.
180 degrees. Unlearn the lies you've been taught to believe by a guy called Fergus O'Connor Greenwood.
And who is this Fergus O'Connor Greenwood?
He came out of absolutely nowhere. This is the thing. There was no record of his existence on the internet before. He's never written anything before. And suddenly he's able to produce I think about a couple of hundred copies, beautifully wrapped with even a personalized message to every single speaker and exhibitor who was at that conference. And that included all of the big names and all of the major influencers who'd been in that medical freedom movement. Now, the thing is that even before this conference, right, even before it, I was starting to suspect that there were quite a few hardcore anti-Semites and hardcore anti-Israel conspiracy theorists within the movement, because I was already seeing and hearing things like this was all a kind of a Zionist plot. So the vaccines, obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government didn't help themselves by being very prominent in promoting the Pfizer vaccine. He called it, he said that Israel was like a lab, and so for the vaccine, and they were hard on lockdowns and stuff like that. So, as with anything, there's a little bit of a grain of truth, But even before that, as I say, when I'd been to demonstrations or I'd been to talks, I'd actually given talks. There were people like David Icke, let's say, and Piers Corbyn, who were being lionised as part of that movement, who I knew were rather dangerous conspiracy theorists and, presenting, highly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So I was kind of aware about that and, aware of that stuff. And yeah, that it really hit me with this book being presented at the conference, because when you look at the book, it actually appears to be very well written. It appears to be very well referenced, right? But what you actually find in there is that it's basically a narrative which says that all of the really bad things that have happened in society in the last several decades, including all of the terrorist attacks I may add, were not done by Arab terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, or ISIS or whatever. No, these were all done or created or funded by either the Israelis, Mossad, the American CIA, or the British, the MI5, MI6. So it completely turns, it basically says that everything is due to the actions of Israel, the US, and America. And of course, Israel's particularly singled out as being behind this. And this narrative completely ignores or excuses, for example, the role of countries like Russia, China, and Iran, who've been the much more significant players in these types of funding to terrorists. And in the case of Iran, have actually organized and funded many of the worst terrorist attacks. Also the Arab countries. So Saudi Arabia, obviously the Palestinians, Syria, Qatar, none of these countries, right? It's actually quite a racist approach, because according to guys like this, these countries have no agency of their own. Arab terrorists only do, well, they don't even accept that these are Arab terrorists. So he actually accuses of particular terrorist attacks, like old PLO terrorist attacks in the 1970s. He actually says, oh no, these weren't PLO terrorists. They were actually Israelis pretending to be Palestinian terrorists.
So the Munich Olympics terrorist attack, for example, was organised by the Israelis, was it?
Yeah, all of that stuff. It'll be, of course, it's all organised, but it was a case of the what was the ship where they hijacked a ship and they threw that guy in a wheelchair, Leon Klinghoffer, killed him. He says that was actually just Israelis dressed as pretending to be Palestinian terrorists. He actually says that, right. And the thing is, his sources is what he actually uses as his sources here are these anti-Zionist Jews or Israelis, many of whom have been completely discredited anyway. In fact, all of these guys have been completely discredited. But it's a tactic which is used consistently to basically protect themselves from accusations of anti-Semitism, because they'll say, look, I'm only saying what these other Jews and Israelis are saying. So, it can't possibly be anti-Semitism for me raising these kinds of issues.
Yeah. So to write a book which is like 1,000 pages long, and like you say, it's got a very good sort of glitzy cover and everything. From someone who's got no track record, no credentials, it's a little bit suspicious, isn't it? There must be someone else behind it.
Yeah, I actually believe. I'm going to go into a conspiracy theory here now, because there is lots of evidence that, for example, that the Qatar was funding various sort of Palestinian student movements all over the world to prepare for something like October the 7th, shortly before October the 7th. Even in London, the Palestinian Solidarity Committee had applied for a mass demonstration to be held shortly after October 7th, but they'd applied for it a week before. Did you know that?
In fact, because I interviewed Mark Burbuck from Our Fight UK. Yep. And he told me he actually turned up there, and he was shocked to see that so soon they'd organised to be there.
Oh, not only did they organise it in advance, but they had a mass demonstration on the night of October 7th. Whilst the mass
had all the placards printed and everything. It was all
everything, and already trying to turn the narrative round into one that Israel is already committing genocide, where the real genocide was actually still in the process of being committed against all those Israeli communities, right? But we can come on to that, how they did that, how that narrative was spun also. But the key thing about that book, right, is that I was getting messages from people who I really quite respected within that medical freedom movement, who was saying, wow, this book is incredible. It really has opened my eyes to what's been going on in the world. So many people were saying this. So I think, coming back to my conspiracy here, that I think that was part of the priming that was done to prepare for October the 7th. That was priming people who were already naturally inclined to not believe what sort of government was saying, who were naturally conspiratorial, because unfortunately there were a lot of highly conspiratorial, deeply skeptical people within that medical freedom movement. And so these, in a sense, a lot of those would be natural people to push a particular message, which was a counter message, which was a counter narrative to what you could actually see happening with your own eyes. I had actually written a series of articles with Karen Harradine for the Conservative Woman website about this increasing anti-Semitism within the medical freedom movement just 2 weeks or a week before October the 7th. So I could feel there was some dynamic, curious dynamic going on.
Now, just to be clear, I mean, you're not against people if they criticize Israel. You've criticized Israel yourself on several issues. Do you want to just tell the audience what sort of things, for example, give examples of how you've criticized the Israeli government, for example?
Well, obviously, I was highly critical of the Israeli government over their COVID stance, the lockdowns, and then the COVID vaccine stance. In fact, I was involved in a series of battles with, for example, the Lancet magazine over articles which had been written by Israeli so-called researchers, which were promoting, making claims about the vaccine efficacy, which I was showing were false. And and I was exposing problems with the Israeli Ministry of Health and how they were basically misusing the data and hiding the data and all that kind of stuff. So I had that. My other issues were, I thought that the Israelis were being remarkably, I always criticize them for their remarkable naivety about the threat of groups like Hamas. I mean, even just before, whenever, this is quite an important point for the whole October the 7th thing, is that shortly before October the 7th, it is a fact that the Netanyahu government did allow a massive influx of funding from Qatar directly to Hamas. They did it not because they were, I mean, people have interpreted that as meaning, it was Israel that funded Hamas to do October the 7th. That's another one of the conspiracy theories. No, absolutely not. It's because Israel had assumed with Qatar that there was now a long-term peace, a ceasefire, long-term, you'll call it even a peace agreement in place, which would mean that Hamas would no longer be threatening the communities in southern Israel, because they'd been lobbing, rockets, for many years, and they'd ever so often they'd try a sort of a minor breach of the border. But the rocket attacks were happening fairly consistently. And the idea was that by pumping this money from Qatar, it wasn't Israel, Israel allowed Qatar to pump this massive funding into Hamas, which the Israelis naively saw as something which would stop for a very long time any terrorism threat from Hamas, because they're now going to build. They're really building up their economic infrastructure, and they wouldn't want to be bothered about these kinds of things. And in fact, I've also heavily criticised the government for taking this, again, also a naive, this similar to what the British government is doing here with the threat from. They see the threat from the far right as more dangerous than the threat from the Islamists. Believe it or not, that was happening in Israel. So they were arresting people who they considered from the far right. They saw a lot of those as a more direct threat than Islamic terrorists within Israel itself. So these are the kind of things. And I was very, very critical, been very critical of those types of things.
You're happy if anyone criticizes Israeli government policies and that, but there's a difference between that and being anti-Semitic. So you're specifically talking about things that are anti-Semitic. Do you want to give us an example so that the viewers can sort of like see the distinction between the two as well?
Yeah. So whereas some reasonable criticism, Israel is certainly not anti-Semitic. Jews, proper Zionist Jews like myself, as said, do it all the time. It's where you use obvious fake stories and photos, often stuff that comes directly from Hamas, as manufactured propaganda. Use that to direct your criticism of Israel. So, for example, what we've got at the moment is this completely fabricated nonsense, not just about genocide in Gaza, but specifically about Israel deliberately deliberately starving children in Gaza. And a very good example of this was this photograph that was on the front page of several of the major newspapers. It started with the New York Times, and then the Daily Express, the Mirror here had it, Guardian, of course. And it was a complete lie, right? This skeletal child actually had a congenital disorder, and actually the photo was also cropped, because when you see the full photo, you see that there's a very, let's say, podgy, to say the least, mother, and a completely healthy and certainly non-skinny child who was the brother next to him. And it turned out that not only did they have this congenital disease from birth, which meant that he couldn't eat properly, but actually 2 months before this story went out, Israel had actually helped get the child out of Gaza and get medical treatment in Italy, right? And all of this, with even the minimum of journalistic integrity, could have been found out, but the New York Times decided not to do it. People like David Collier here and others, in fact, it was even before David Collier did a very detailed expose of this, which was subsequently picked up by some of the mainstream. In fact, the New York Times was actually forced to make an apology.
I actually made a video about all these fake starvation pictures and that. And I think what was interesting was that the original fake news was put on the X account of the New York Times, which had millions of followers. So it was seen by, I think it was like over 18 million or something. The apology, however, was just on a very much smaller scale to a much smaller audience. So they were sort of like covering their back, but the damage is done. See, I mean,
exactly. No, the damage is done. And I'll give you an anecdote, another anecdote about that particular lie. So I was shocked that people who, up until that point, conservative commentators who had always been pretty sympathetic to Israel and had refused to swallow the lies which were being pushed by, on behalf of Hamas by these sort of mainstream sources. I was shocked that somehow that photo was a turning point. So a very good example of that, Michelle Dewberry, GB News, right, who put out that photo. She actually posted the front page, an image from the front page of the Daily Express with the photo on, and basically the message, the words were, look, I've been sympathetic up until now, but this has got to stop. Now let's try and analyze this, and I'll tell you what happened afterwards. But think about this. Let's think about it. Look, even if that was a genuine photo of a starving child from Gaza, even if that child had been deliberately starved, which has certainly never happened, even if it was, let's compare that. Let's think about what she's saying and what other people are saying there. Right, because I've seen that photo of that child, I believe we've now got to put pressure on Israel to completely stop the war, forget about trying to save its hostages, right, and just let things go back to what they were with Hamas in control. Think about if that had happened during the Second World War, if a photo, let's say, of a badly burnt child in Dresden, Germany, after the Allies had bombed it. Imagine if that had been the front page of all the newspapers. Would it have made sense then in 1944 to say, oh, well, we've seen this now. This has now got to stop. We've got to leave Hitler in power. We've got to stop the war now, leave Hitler in power. Does that make sense that a single photo should do that? That's what I'm saying is it's ridiculous, even if it was a true, not a fake photo. But it was a fake photo anyway. So it becomes absolutely disgraceful. Now, what really annoyed me is I don't know Michelle Dewberry. Fun enough, I did actually meet her once when I did an interview at GB News, right? But I've got no direct contact with her. But I did. I think maybe we follow each other on X. So I was able to, I don't know if it's a direct message, no, but I replied to her on that, saying very, very politely, look, this has been debunked. Here's a link to it being debunked. At least put up, some sort of statement about, saying that actually that was a fake photo. absolutely no response. It's still up. And what really got me was that so many people, including people I admire and like, actually replied to her, supporting it, saying, yeah, this has done it for me as well. That type of attitude. I mean, it's so infuriating that the propaganda can be used in that way to convince even the most sympathetic people. And look, there's plenty of people in the in that medical freedom movement who had long, as I say, right from the beginning, had basically swallowed the Hamas-driven propaganda about the whole Gaza war, right? I mean, what really makes me angry about that, and I think I made this is a question actually I put to the panel yesterday at Tuesday's event, is that I said, how is it possible that so many excellent critical thinking new media influencers who saw through all the mainstream media and globalist lies over COVID and climate change, how is it that they swallow without questioning the much more blatant lies demonizing Israel over Gaza? And that those lies are pushed by exactly the same media and globalists that they knew they shouldn't trust before.
I think there's a simple criteria that can be applied that should make you ask questions first before believing it. Because, I mean, I remember the starvation pictures from Biafra in Nigeria. I remember the starvation pictures in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Sudan. And with those, none of them were selective pictures of starvation. So if there was starvation,
Yep,
everyone in the photograph was starving. You didn't have like a
exactly.
fat mother and a starving child, or a group of sort of like healthy looking adults, and then like just one starving child. Everyone was starving, and with these
Yep,
pictures, it's always like very, very selective. You know, and in one of the pictures, there was even a bottle of milk on the shelf next to
yeah.
the child that was supposed to be starving. So um, it's just incredible how they keep falling for it. But see, the thing is,
And it's so
the
obviously,
media
I mean,
sets the
look
world
at
on
just,
fire with this sort of fake news. Right? I mean, we have Lucy Connolly,
yeah,
who's facing like, I don't know, is it 15 months jail she's sentenced to? Because
30 months, 13, I
she
think she'll
she
be
she
out.
she posted a stupid post on her X account. She almost immediately deleted it. It was seen by very few people. Compare that with the way the media sets the world on fire. Like, for example, the claim that Israel had rocket attacked the Shifa hospital, which turned out to be like
Yep.
Hamas's own failed rockets. But the damage was done. They set the world on fire, and yet there's no consequences for them.
It's happening over and over again with these types of fake news stories in Gaza. I mean, you've got they're ignoring the fact that Israel's continually been providing massive aid trucks going through, but they're continually being hijacked by Hamas, right? So if there's any starvation at all, and I don't believe there's that much, it's created by Hamas, who basically take control of the trucks and then get their money from selling it on into the markets. It never goes directly to the people it was supposed to be given them. It's only this American initiative which has actually more recently been able to bypass Hamas. And what happens? All of the international agencies and all of the anti-Israel governments want to close that down. They want to give it back to the United Nations, UNRWA, and those people who are basically working with Hamas to actually distribute aid. So you've got all that, but all of the story, as you say, the starvation. I mean, you can see videos. You actually can see videos, and I recommend a site called Gazawood for this, where they're actually staging all of these so-called famine pictures.
We had the German newspaper Bild and
Yeah,
Zeitung also that exposed this staging of the photographs by these pro-Hamas press that are out there.
you'd think anyone with a rational mind would see that this is just complete nonsense and propaganda, and you'd think especially the people who were alert and awake during COVID and saw the lies from the official narrative there would be awake to it, but they're not. I mean, I can give you some more examples. I'll give you another example. I'll name names here because I had a public, I guess you could call it a public spat with Andrew Bridgen, former
Yeah.
MP, over this. It's a very good example, right? So what happened as follows: is that, first of all, I was pretty close and friendly with Andrew Bridgen as a result, of working together on the whole COVID thing. In fact, I had a 3-hour. I travelled with him 3-hour car journey to that conference, that Better Way conference in 2023. So I know Andrew Bridgen pretty well. And when in I can't remember, I think it was prior to that, that was when he'd already been accused of being an anti-Semite by Matt Hancock. And at that point, of course, this was before October 7th, at that point, I had actually made a public video, which kind of went viral, defending Andrew Bridgen, saying that the comments he'd made, where they told me it was like denying the Holocaust, it was absolutely not that. He was not making it. He was not denying the Holocaust. He wasn't minimizing the Holocaust, right? What he said was definitely not anti-Semitic, right? And that therefore, what he was saying, there was no way that it was justified for Matt Hancock to call him an anti-Semite over that. So I went public on that, supporting Andrew Bridgen, and I was supposed to be. In fact, I spoke to his lawyers, and I'd agreed that I would, because they interviewed me with a view to being a character witness for any forthcoming trial with a libel case with Hancock, and I was going to give a written testimony as well, right? We're going to make an affidavit, but very, very shortly after October the 7th, Andrew posted one of these obviously fake stories, which was a complete blood libel. In fact, he even went on record in Parliament to speak about it, claiming that Israel deliberately shot some nuns at a Catholic church in Gaza. Again, a story which had already been debunked, absolutely categorically debunked. So I asked, Andrew, I said, actually that's been debunked, Andrew. Can you retract that? Right? Because that's just pushing out this blood libel. And whereas he would reply to me on lots of other things, he never replied about this.
He never replied to you?
Never. No, but wait a minute, it gets worse. It gets worse because after when the case, that was maybe November 2023, I still saw him, and every so often I would, when I did see him, I would mention it. Didn't get any response back. He never apologized for this. Come the next summer, it was about, it must have been about sort of summer of 2024. His lawyers, I think it was a new lawyer, it wasn't one used last time, approached me again to say, am I still going to give a test, character witness at the forthcoming libel case? And I said, well, I'll do it, provided Andrew finally apologizes for that blood libel he spread online and in Parliament. And the lawyer said, okay, he thought that was, he obviously thought that was a reasonable thing. And he said, okay, I'll ask Andrew. Shortly after, I get an email from the lawyer, and it said, well, it seems that we won't be able to use you as a witness. In other words, he point blank, he was actually so determined not to apologize for that blood libel that he would sacrifice having me as a character witness at his trial. Mm. And guess who was one of the people who pushed in a big way the fake photo of that starving child a few weeks ago? Andrew Bridgen, again, he reposted it.
The New York Times one or the Daily Express one?
I can't remember which, but again, it was with the headline, "This must stop." And again, several people, not just me, several people have raised the concern with him there, asked him to apologise, remove it. Absolutely nothing.
In that video that I made about the fake or real picture of the starvation, there was also a footage of a baby, and it was claiming that this baby is starving so much that can't even cry. Right? So very emotional. I mean, you've got to be very hard-hearted if you don't get emotional about something like that. And that was seen by 1 million people. It turned out that was a footage from a neonatal nurse's Facebook page. And again, it was nothing to do with Gaza. It wasn't even a Palestinian child.
Yep.
It was the typical symptom of some of the babies that have this rare condition of having seizures,
Yep.
and they have this sort of like unusual ways of like crying that it looks like they can't even cry. And then they were claiming that. I mean, you've got to be very callous to use a picture of a baby in that, who's going through that plight to uh, to gain your own political agenda.
The thing is, if there really was a genocide going on, if there really was starvation, if they really were, as they're now claiming almost every day, killing dozens of Palestinians who are just trying to get aid, there would be proper video evidence. Everybody in Gaza seems to have a mobile phone. Nobody's ever produced a verified picture of any Israeli soldiers deliberately shooting at people trying to get food, or this other ridiculous story they were deliberately shooting children in the head, and they produced some ridiculous photo which was easily debunked about this. And yet they have to resort apparently not only to faking stuff, but as you say, very often the images they use are from completely different wars. They're from from Syria from years ago and all this kind of stuff. I mean, if it was happening, why would they need to fake it if it was really happening?
That was exactly my question in the video. I have to send you a link to that video.
Why don't they just, these people pushing this stuff, and it's got to end? Why wouldn't someone like Michel Dubry say, because of that photo, this has now got to end? There should be an immediate ceasefire. Why don't people like that simply say, well, just release the bloody hostages, Hamas, and that will end?
Exactly. It's as simple as that, really.
No, they just. You look at. I did a search. Because Bridgen has posted quite a lot of nasty stuff about Israel, right? And the only time he's ever mentioned Hamas, which he did mention it shortly after, he mentioned it on October the 10th, 2023. He said, "Yeah, it's really what Hamas did was terrible, but there's always a but we've got to make sure that Israel's response is disproportionate," he said on that occasion. And again, there's always, I think he mentioned Hamas 3 times, but there was always a but. Israel's doing worse things than Hamas, right? But the other thing is, I searched. So he's posted a lot about it, but I did a search on how many times he's posted about the hostages. And of course, it comes up, no, he's not a single time he mentioned the word hostages in any of his posts.
And just before speaking to you today, Norman, I saw this video from the Sweden hospital. You know what was happening, the massacre of the Druze in Sweden, in Syria.
The Druze,
And I mean, I'd seen the footage of like dead bodies in the hospital before, but this video clearly showed that the medical staff were rounded up and they were being killed. They were being shot at in cold blood. And yet, how many protests did we see about the massacre against the massacre of the Druze?
Not only did we not see any protests about it, right? But remember that when there's all of the Islamists were, including sort of ISIS people were actually attacking the Druze villages around Sweden at the time, right? And they were actually under direct threat of a real genocide. That's when Israel intervened to stop it, and what they did was they bombed those buildings they bombed the regime buildings in Damascus, making it clear to say that this has to stop. And what happened? The world went crazy. That why is Israel bombing Syria now? And none of them mentioned that this was a direct response to stop the massacre going on against the Druze.
It looks like at the moment, with the help of all the mainstream media and people not being critical in questioning what they're first hearing there, that Hamas are winning the narrative, doesn't it?
It does, but that actually reminds me of a very important story about how the narrative was originally changed starting on October the 7th. And actually, this is something which I have kind of intimate knowledge of, right? Because I want to talk about this. So on October the 7th, while the massacre was still going on, an Israeli woman, I won't say the name, I don't want to give her any publicity whatsoever. People can easily find this out if they do a bit of search. An Israeli woman who is basically an anti-Zionist. She's a hardcore, one of these left-wing, but one of these anti-Zionist Tel Avivians, right? She who incidentally was one of these influencers within the medical freedom movement. That's how I knew her, right? I'd actually been in communication with her many times. I was supposed to be on her podcast 3 days after October the 7th. That had been planned, right? I knew she was, I was quite, I hadn't met her until the Bethway conference, but we've been in communication. When I was at that conference, I knew that she was kind of like a hardcore anti-Zionist because of things that she'd said there, right? So, for example, some punk Canadian guy came up to her and said, because he knew that she was Israeli, and said, "Oh, what Israel's doing to the Palestinians is terrible." And she basically, not only didn't reprimand him over coming up and saying that to her, but sort of went along, really supported him, saying, "Oh yeah, it's terrible that basically effectively saying that we Jews don't deserve our own state," or what words to that effect. Anyway, she on October the 7th put out a video while the massacre was still happening. It was early evening. She put out a video on X, which basically was the video that started this false narrative that October the 7th was an inside job. She was saying that because of her intelligence experience, she made out that she had intelligence experience, which she basically didn't have. She was just a conscript, like all young women conscripted in the army to go into the intelligence grade. They just go to the sort of borders and they just observe and stuff like that. She claims that because of her intelligence knowledge about the Gaza border from when she was in the army, in the intelligence unit, and people, of course, have since claimed that she was actually a high level intelligence officer. That's what she's been described as. That she knew that border couldn't have been breached in the way it was because she knew all about the technology, blah, blah, blah. It couldn't have happened unless it was an inside job. That's the narrative that she put out, right? So I contacted her immediately when I saw this. And I said to her, what you've just put out is extremely dangerous because you're going to immediately change. We are in the middle of the worst massacre, genuine genocide of Jews since the Holocaust, right? Completely unprovoked mass terrorist attack. And you have now given comfort to those who want to immediately turn this narrative round and say, well, the Jews are to blame for it themselves. That's what you have done. I said it actually in a very diplomatic and friendly way. And I said to her, look, you need to just now go on and clarify that you have no idea what has really gone on. Nobody has any idea yet. I mean, of course, it turns out there were lots of intelligence failures. There were lots of, as I mentioned, the stupidity of the Israeli government to believe the Qataris and Hamas.
As there is with any terrorist attack anywhere. I mean, 7/7 was an intelligence failure. Didn't mean that it was an inside job.
Exactly. You've got to now clarify that. Well, no. Oh, and she said, oh, it's my truth. It's my truth. That's all that sort of nonsense which these idiot conspiracy theories say. She went on, and next day, she was actually, she was interviewed by people like Bev Turner on GB News the next day, basically telling the same ridiculous narrative. And I said to her, that's going to be used by all the anti-Semites, all the anti-Israel freaks to turn this around. My God, that video went viral and did exactly what I said it would do, which was change this narrative. She got onto what makes it even more disgusting because of her involvement in the medical freedom movement. She's a very good self-publicist. She went directly that day to all of the key influencers in the movement. I mean, I can even name some names here. So it wasn't just Bev Turner. It was people like Brett Weinstein, Ava Valadinger-Brook, Neil Oliver, who I can tell you other stories about him, Ahmed Malik, and all these people. She went to them to push this story. And all of them, and these are people who had not been anti-Israel before. Again, these are people, I don't know about Neil Oliver, but the others had not been anti-Israel before. I would have thought they were people who would be naturally very sympathetic to Israel in the immediate light of this incredibly devastating terrorist attack. Every single one of them repeated her lie about this being an inside job. Every one of them, right, went public on this. And it's quite funny because, you know, that with Neil Oliver, I had a public spat with him, you know, following not just that, because he was started to put out some outrageous blood libels. He made, you know, he does these monologues. He used to do these monologues at the end of his 1 hour program on GB News on Saturday nights. One of them, he basically he said, Israel is raining white phosphorus bombs onto the killing. It's incinerating thousands of Palestinian children. He said white phosphorus they were using to incinerate thousands of Palestinian children. He actually said that. I know him personally. I had an hour-long conversation with him on the phone after that, so pointing out that, for example, there was actually white phosphorus in a war is not illegal, but actually Israel stopped using that. The only last time it did that was in a previous conflict. It hasn't used it this time. It's just used to basically create a kind of a smoke screen. They haven't used it at all, right? But the idea that it was that thousands of Palestinian children were being incinerated deliberately.
And again, no pictures.
No, of course, nothing. And I simply said to him, look, I'm a free speech absolutist, right? I am. I really am. I said, I've got no problems with you saying that if you think that was true. But since we can prove it's not true, you do at least have an obligation to tell your audience next week that actually perhaps that wasn't true.
I mean, is it just these people because they're anti-Semitic, or they're just being swept by the overwhelming amounts of propaganda that's in the media?
Even now, every day for almost 2 years now, we've had the news reports being led with these essentially fake stories from Gaza. This, you know, the genocide, like, you know, with these, you know, interviewing people who are effectively Hamas operatives.
I mean, just to wrap things up, Norman, because I know you have to go, and I appreciate your time speaking to me, actually. But just to wrap things up, I mean, we've been here before. You know, we've been in situations where we've had to fight against the overwhelming narrative that's been fake, and it's been lies, and we've had it with, I've had it in my experience from things that were happening in Iran, the way they were duping people in the West. We've had this with COVID, and, you know, there's been all these other instances. But I like to think about Václav Havel's quotes, which is one of my favorite quotes, where he said, in the end, love and truth will win over hate and lies. So do we have grounds to be optimistic?
You'd think so, but I think that the forces lined up against truth in this case may be overwhelming. That's my concern.
Well, that's a sobering note to end this with. Thanks again for speaking to me tonight, and I know you have to go, so I'll let you go. Hopefully, we can talk on other occasions about other things as well.
Yeah, well, it's been great speaking to you. Yeah,
and hope to see you in person again on some other event or occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All the best. Thank you, Norman.